Hi, Ryan Dinse here. Today I'm joined from New Zealand by Daniel Batten. Daniel is an entrepreneur and a long-time investor in climate technology. I'll let Daniel tell you a bit more about himself in a second. But I think his unique background and interest in climate investing is a big reason I wanted to speak to him today. As you know, Ethereum just completed the merge, the move away from a proof of work consensus system to a proof of stake system. And a big benefit of that being touted quite loudly right now is that this makes Ethereum far less energy intensive than Bitcoin, and hence a lot better for the environment. Now, there's a lot to unpack in that claim, but there's no doubt the mainstream has constantly attacked Bitcoin in the past for its energy use, and the transition by Ethereum to proof of stake network is only going to help ramp up those attacks. We're starting to see that already. Now, we could argue back and say the energy use is worth it. After all, if energy use for electric cars is good, why not for sound money? Or we could argue that the energy use is the thing that helps keep the network secure and decentralized. For example, it doesn't matter how many Bitcoin you own, you have no more say than the lowest holder. There's even some fairly loud Bitcoiners out there, like Austrian economist Seyfedin Ammous, who claim that climate change isn't real anyway, so it's a pointless argument to get into. Now, our guest today doesn't think that, or at least I don't think he does, and he's spent a lot of his life investing in solutions to environmental problems. Now, here's the interesting part. Daniel says Bitcoin mining is actually good for fighting climate change and even has the potential to reduce global warming by a massive 0.15 degrees Celsius. Let's find out how. Daniel, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. Good to be here.
Now, first up, I think it'd be good to give our subscribers a little bit of your background, which is pretty interesting, and how that led you to Bitcoin.
Sure. Well, there's been a number of different phases in what I've done in life, and I won't recount them all, but a plotted history was I've been an environmental activist for a long time. I was brought into a community where my mother was an environmental campaigner. The whole community where I was part of, there was a rubbish tip proposed, and all the locals of the community got together to fight it and actually won and stopped that rubbish tip, which would have been disastrous environmentally from polluting the entire area. And so I was inspired by that story as a young child and went on as a teenager and as a young man to go on many protests against deep sea oil drilling off our coasts, got involved in a lot of Greenpeace campaigns, was a longtime supporter of Greenpeace, got involved in many of their actions and volunteer activities as well. And then at some point in the journey, I had a couple of friends who became members of Greenpeace, and I realized that that wasn't going to be my path. Not because I didn't share their values, I 100% share the values, but I realized that I was going to use different ways to make an impact. And how I've chosen to do that for the next 10 years or so has been through technology and through doing what I know about, which is about using investment to do good, using venture capitalism as an investment vehicle to disproportionately back technologies which you believe in, which you believe are going to make a positive difference to the environment. So I've been investing in technology since 2000. I've run my own startup company, which exited 3 years ago. And we formed a climate tech VC company 2.5 years ago, and we've had 2 funds so far. So we invest in companies that can do amazing things for the world in terms of climate. So for example, we invested in a company recently who have a way to strip fossil fuel use out of the entire greenhouse industry globally, take us off our reliance on gas, which is even more timely than ever now, and replace it with a carbon neutral source. And so that's a technology we got behind. And so we've been looking to do that for a little while. Earlier this year, I reached a point where I was reading some of the IPCC reports and the United Nations Environmental Program reports, and I noticed a shift in 2 things. One was a shift in the urgency, which was saying, hey, if we don't sort things out and make some serious differences pre-2030, it may actually be too late. We may already have runaway climate loops. That was the first thing. And the second shift with the United Nations Environment Program was, for the first time ever last year, they started shifting the narrative to only being about carbon dioxide to being able to saying, look, it's actually equally about methane. In fact, they made this incredible announcement. This was Inger Andersen, the executive director of the United Nations Environment Program, who said that methane represents our strongest lever to fight climate change in the next 25 years. And it complements, not replaces, complements our efforts to also reduce carbon dioxide levels.
Right.
So that got me feeling uncomfortable because as a venture capitalist, we invest in high-risk technologies. To be frank, a lot of them won't see the light of day. They won't achieve scale. It's a high-risk industry, and we spread our risk by investing in many companies.
Yep.
And the other thing is that it takes time for these technologies to come to market to achieve scale. It might take anywhere between 5 to 8 years before it really has a global impact. Well, 8 years, we're past 2030.
Yep.
So that got me really thinking, if I want to make an impact, am I actually making the really deep impact that I can be with the tools that I have? And the answer was no. So I made a decision that we needed to invest in technologies that, number one, they had an impact today. So not future technologies. Yes, we need to keep on investing in those. But where I saw an underinvestment was technologies that were already proven today that we could use to fight climate change right now, number one.
Yeah.
And number two, there's a very interesting statistic where right now climate tech is this huge growth area. 14 cents out of every dollar in venture capitalism is going towards climate tech. It's growing very, very fast. However, not all of that money is going to the required areas. In fact, we know that it's not. We know that methane is as much of a problem, if not more, than carbon dioxide right now. And yet only 2% of climate change money goes into methane mitigation. The other 98% is all into carbon dioxide. So I said, okay, right. So firstly, we've got to restore this balance. We've got to look at methane because that's actually the more urgent issue right now.
Yeah.
And secondly, we need to start investing in technologies that are ready now, pre-2030, not only post-2000. And again, it's not an either or, it's a both and. But in terms of my time, I want to be focusing on the issue that's urgent and as high as impact as possible. At the same time, I was researching Bitcoin and getting fascinated in that. And that was the third leg of what was coming together. And I was starting to hear different claims. There's the environmental claims saying that Bitcoin is terrible for the environment, as you said, because it has high energy consumption. And we need to lower consumption and invest in technologies that don't have such high energy consumption, particularly in this day and age. But I also had my friends in the Bitcoin community who were saying, no, that's not true. Bitcoin, and the untold story is it's helping to build out the renewable grid because solar operators, wind operators, who are waiting 3 years, 4 years, 5 years in a grid interconnection queue, who can't get onto the grid because of the queues, because they can't get financed. If you have a Bitcoin mining customer, then you don't have to be on the grid because they can sit and co-locate at a solar operator. So you can be generating money before you get onto the grid. And of course, you've got a customer. That then means that you're likely to get finance. And of course, you get finance. That means you're more likely to get your grid application approved. So I could see the logic in that argument as well. And I started to say, right, okay, time to close my ears and not listen to either of you, but to do my own research, put on my analyst hat for the first time in a long time. Also, frankly, put on my due diligence hat as a VC and say, let's do due diligence on Bitcoin as a technology with all the scrutiny that I would do if I were doing due diligence on a technology company. In other words, it's my role to be skeptical and not to accept anything that I've read until I've validated it from first principles. So that was the journey that I set out on a few months ago.
Excellent. And you mentioned a few things there, and we should probably talk more about them. The fact that there is inherent biases in the mainstream argument without people looking at it. And there's probably biases in the Bitcoin argument as well. You know, I obviously looked at this from a Bitcoin proponent perspective for a long time, since 2013. So I'm always eager to find out ways it is good, but sometimes you have to take that step back and take that neutral approach. And I think your background suggests that, you know, there's some credibility to you taking that approach in a genuine way, the VC and also the climate background. But you talked on two things about Bitcoin mining, which I think are misunderstood generally. And the first one you talked about there was Bitcoin as a grid stabilizer, or was sort of as a grid stabilizer in that, you know, solar and wind power are good for the environment, obviously, in terms of carbon dioxide emissions. But the way that grids are designed is they need to balance load. And sometimes they have too much power and they need to get rid of it. And sometimes they don't have enough. And coming back to what you were saying about, near-term solutions, a lot of people that I speak to tend to say, well, what about batteries? If you've got solar power or wind power, why don't you just install a battery? And if there's excess power, the battery can store it and use it for later. Rather than why does it need to be a Bitcoin miner that comes in and uses that power? And I've sort of tried to explain that, and you might have more thoughts on this, but I've tried to explain, look, battery technology is great, but we're still probably 10 years away from mass scale, minerals being available, commodities, battery technology being at that grid scale. Is that something you would agree with, or?
Yes, it is. And the reason I agree with that is because I spent a while talking to solar engineers and people who have worked specifically on batteries. And again, it's not an either or. There is a time when battery is the right solution. Yep. There's also a time when Bitcoin is the right solution. There's a time when it's a combination and you arbitrage between the two.
Yeah.
So I'll give you an example. And yes, those things you say are true about the economics of batteries. Sometimes it's not the most economic solution. Sometimes it is. Availability of minerals, etc. There's some other problems as well. And again, this comes out of grids are complex things. And that's one of the problems that Bitcoin faces is Bitcoin is not easy to understand. And then grids are not easy to understand. And until this year, I just thought electricity was something you do this and you switch on a light and it comes on. And that was about as much as I knew, apart from some high school physics, which I'd forgotten most of. But I had to understand and wrap my head. So you've got to understand a little bit about grids and a little bit about Bitcoin. And the problem is that if you don't have that understanding, it's very easy to come up with statements which sound accurate, but actually are not.
Yeah.
And so it's in the nuance. And the nuances that I've come to understand, I'll give you an example. So say you have some spare solar capacity or some spare wind capacity, because there's two problems. Number one, you might produce solar and wind in a place where people don't need it. And so you've got to transport it.
Yep.
And you say, well, that's okay. We can just transport it through transmission lines. Well, transmission lines are like highways. They only have so many lanes. And so if there's too much capacity, then you have to spill it into the ground.
No.
And the second issue is that you might be producing that solar in the middle of the day when there's no demand. You might be producing that wind in the middle of the night when there's no demand. So what do you do with that extra supply? And the answer has been you spill it into the ground, and there's tremendous amounts of waste energy. And most models you have of the renewable build-out all have factored in that even with batteries, you'll still be wasting 20% of that energy. And the reason for that is once a battery is full, it's full.
Yep.
If you have 96 hours of high winds, as happened in Germany recently, and you have a battery which has capacity to store up to 4 hours, well, that extra 92 hours just gets spilled, it gets wasted. The second problem you have with batteries alone is that it leaves you vulnerable to wholesale electricity prices, because you can only monetize that when you sell that power back to the grid or when you use it. So, okay, you sell that battery's full and you want to discharge that so you can top it up again. But what happens if you want to discharge it to the grid and your wholesale electricity prices are zero? What happens if your wholesale electricity prices have gone negative, as they do for 10% of the year in Texas and many parts of the world now, and that's increasing. So you could actually be losing money on batteries. So if you have Bitcoin as well, you can be playing arbitrage and you can be going, it doesn't make sense to discharge it to the grid. We will use that battery for Bitcoin mining.
Yeah.
So you can be constantly working out which it makes more sense to mine, and it makes the whole economics of solar and wind way more viable.
And that's an important point you've made is the thing about Bitcoin mining as that sort of stabilizer is the flexibility inherent in it. Miners can be turned off and on as and when needed, whereas I suppose other uses of that electricity, like a data center or an industrial plant, they've not got that flexibility just to turn off and on.
They'll have some flexibility, but it'll be limited. So some do. So a steel plant, for example, that can fulfill that purpose up to a while.
Yep.
You can switch off a steel plant for up to 4 hours.
Right.
But after 4 hours, steel's going to harden.
Yep.
And the whole pipeline of industrial manufacture is going to start to break down. So you only have a 4-hour window. Now, what happens if you have a heat wave, as happened in Texas recently, is happening in California right now, where it's not 4 hours, but it's 8 hours, or it's for day after day after day after day. You don't have that capacity. And the other thing is it's a fairly blunt instrument. It's either on or it's off.
Yeah.
So grids, as you said, they have a heartbeat. It's like a pulse. And what people don't realize is it's not just a problem where you have too many people wanting electricity. You can also have a problem with instability when not enough people want it.
Yeah.
It's got to maintain a constant heartbeat of 50 or 60 hertz, depending on where the world you are. So these grid operators are constantly trying to keep it balanced. And if you just suddenly switch off a steel factory, you could introduce instability because you've lost too much power. Whereas with Bitcoin mining, you can taper it down to exactly the heartbeat that you need. So it gives much more flexibility and peace of mind to grid operators. And the more you look into it, again, these are all things that are non-obvious. Yeah. They all look beneath the surface. What I often say to people is the best way to think of it is this. In essence, there's two advantages that Bitcoin mining gives to the grid. First thing is it helps more solar and wind power that would have otherwise been economically unviable to get onto the grid because it gives it its first customer, which means it's likely to get finance, which means it can be profitable before it gets onto the grid. So it's and those operators, because they're not wasting their energy, they have a customer who can use it even when no one else wants it. They're more profitable and they use that profit to increase the size of their wind farm or their solar farm. So that's the first advantage.
Yeah.
And then the second advantage is that it can taper up or taper down that usage so it's non-rival. And again, this is where a lot of misinformation has come out that's really, we can actually debunk, it's not an opinion, we can debunk it with data. One of the accidental features of Bitcoin is it has an inbuilt economic incentive. This is not by design, it's by accident. But there is an inbuilt economic incentive to play nice with other users. And it operates very simply. When you're mining Bitcoin, your only variables that will impact your profitability is the cost of equipment, the price of Bitcoin, and the price of wholesale electricity. Yep. Now, the CapEx you've already bought, so you can't control that anymore. The price of Bitcoin, that's beyond your control. You can't control that anymore. The only control you have is whether to mine based on the wholesale electricity cost. And that will determine your profitability. It's a very unique business. You don't have customers.
Yeah.
So wholesale electricity prices go up, it becomes unprofitable to mine, you stop mining. When do wholesale electricity prices go up? When everyone wants electricity at the same time. What does that mean? There is an inbuilt economic incentive that when other people want electricity, Bitcoin miners say it's not profitable to mine. So it's a non-rival source of electricity. So again, it's not opinion. Yeah. This is actually an inbuilt economic incentive. And if we look at the way that they've been behaving recently, like in Texas, that's exactly the way they've been behaving. Yeah. What they will typically do to stay viable is they will take a hedge. They will trade that and they'll take a hedge on wholesale electricity prices against that wholesale electricity spike so that even though they're not mining, they can still be winning on their energy trade. Right. So they stay profitable, but they're non-rival user. I say it's like this. We can think of the grid like a highway. And imagine you have a highway. Whereabouts are you from, Ryan?
We're in Melbourne at the moment.
You're in Melbourne. Okay. So I don't know how big your highways are. They're probably about 5 lanes, 6 lanes, maybe.
Yeah, about that, yeah.
About 6 lanes. So say you've got a 6-lane highway, but it's still congested car. And then you have a nice, friendly infrastructure developer who comes along and says, hey, I'll tell you what, we'll give you some money to build an extra 2 lanes of highway. And Ministry of Transport say, that's fantastic. What's the catch? And they say, well, the catch is we want to have the rights to use that highway. And they say, well, won't that just recreate the same problem? And they say, well, no, it won't, because we'll have a clause in the contract which says that we will only use it between peak hour. So we'll only use it between the times when not everyone else is using, and that when everyone else is using, it's not economical for us to use, so we'll pull over to the shoulder of the road. Yeah. So everyone gets the benefit of that additional infrastructure, and then everyone gets the benefit of then being a non-rival user. That's the closest analogy that I can think of to describe the way that Bitcoin mining operations are interacting with the grid.
Yeah, it's a good analogy because like you said, I mean, I've spent the last year trying to get my head around the grid and stuff like that as well. And it is complex. And like you said, when people are trying to work out the complexities of Bitcoin mining in an environment where a lot of people just want to keep it simple and throw out ad hoc sort of arguments about Bitcoin mining bad, to get to this level of complexity takes a bit of effort, but I think the lane analogy works really well. It's like it's a win-win. It's Bitcoin miners provide this service And that incentivizes renewable development on the financing front. And it also helps the grid react better, which actually benefits the economics of the grid. Like you alluded to before, I didn't know this until this year either, but power prices can go negative. Power companies can have to pay for someone to take their electricity. That's crazy. You don't realize how variable the electricity demand is in the day. They build so much excess capacity in there just to cover the times of extreme load, which they don't use a lot of the time either. So the efficiencies that Bitcoin mining brings in by bringing this flexibility is immense if people can understand it. And I think that the lane analogy is a really good way of sort of visualizing that.
Well, the alternative is you have a deep, in-depth discussion to me about ancillary services and spinning reserves and curtailment, and then your head starts to spin. And so I don't recommend that unless you're really, if you're interested, you can check out my website where I go, but I don't recommend you.
Maybe next time. Website. I think my brain will be spinning by
because
then.
It's got a lot of maths in there. It's not complex maths, but it mentions a lot of the bottom line is this. What I've tried to do is talk to people who know way more about grids, way more about energy and electricity than I do, and then summarize my understanding. And again, these are smart people who are not Bitcoiners. These are people who are energy engineers, solar engineers. I've looked at what people who are CEOs of ERCOT in some cases, Brad Jones, has said about the interaction of Bitcoin with the grid. So we're talking to people who actually understand grids at a deep level, people who work for utilities, people who specialize in what's called demand response. In other words, when your wholesale, when your volumes of demand go up, how do you respond to that? So you've got two choices. You can either ramp up your supply or you can decrease your demand. And what I've tried to do is just to put it into these bite-sized chunks where people can understand it. And it's important that we do, because without that understanding, we're actually vulnerable to taking on false narratives. And there's a lot of false narratives. One of the false narratives is that, Bitcoin miners, they're taking away other people's electricity. Well, that's not true. They do the opposite. We can prove that's not true through both in theory and also in practice.
Yeah.
And then the other thing that might occur is they say, well, they're raising electricity prices. In fact, they're doing the opposite. They're making demand response more competitive, because previously it was only a coal plant or a gas plant that could do demand response. Now you can actually have that done on the side of the consumers of electricity. So it's making it more competitive. The other ways it makes it more competitive is, not many people know this, but a utility company can have an agreement with a solar operator. They've actually got to pay the solar operator or the wind operator every time they say, we can't take your energy. There's a cost, there's a penalty they have to pay to the generator. Now, if that solar operator or that wind operator has Bitcoin mining going on, they don't have to curtail that energy, which means the utility doesn't have to pay a penalty, which means the profitability of the utility is higher and residential consumers get to benefit.
Yeah.
So the actual flow-on effect to residential consumers is positive. And every way you look at it, the more you go into the detail, the more you find more and more ways that Bitcoin is actually, on net balance, I would say by far, it's a net positive to stabilizing our grid, particularly at a time in history where, because of climate change, number one, and number two, because there's more variable renewable energy on the grid, they're becoming more unstable anyway.
Yeah.
Because it's much harder as a grid operator. In the past, when demand spiked, you could just say to your coal plant, hey, can you put more coal on the fire? Or, hey, can you ramp up your gas turbine? Yeah. Well, if you're going to do it on renewables, you can't contact your wind operator and say, hey, can you blow into your wind turbine and create more wind? Yeah. You can't say, hey, can you ask the sun to shine higher? You can't. You don't have that option. So the only option you now have is you don't have that flexibility with generation. You only have flexibility with demand. So your ability to have consumers of electricity who are flexible becomes more and more important. The International Association of Energy has said that by 2050, that 30% of our demand, our flexible demand, will be met by batteries, and 20% will be met by flexible consumers of electricity.
That's a great
We're
point.
Going to go 20 times as high. That's how important it is when we start to build out a grid based on variable renewable energy.
Yeah,
and right now, Bitcoin mining is the single most flexible user of electricity.
Yeah, and it's probably
plays a very important role.
probably at a commercial scale, it's probably one of, the first to be such a, that big a commercial scale. Because, like when you get like hot days in Australia, they might ask you to turn your aircon off, because that is demand flexibility. But that's
demand response. Correct.
Voluntary demand response, bit of societal pressure to help out, the grid, please turn it off, or you'll get rolling blackouts, and that can happen as well. But this is like a commercial level solution.
And it's much more fine-tuned, and it's not based on hope.
Correct.
Yeah, because you don't have to rely on residential consumers playing nice or hearing the message or getting it on their app. You can precisely calibrate, and you can know in advance that you've got this much. It's like a shock absorber.
Yeah.
And you know that you have however many megawatts of power that you can ramp up or down to a precise calibration at any given moment.
Yeah.
And remember, the opposite problem for a grid operator is they could, if they have too extreme a message and demand drops too much, then they've got the opposite problem. So again, the more flexibility they have, the more precise calibration, the more it keeps it at the right level. Because you can have blackouts when you have too much demand, and you can have blackouts when you have not enough demand.
Yeah. Yeah, it's such a, like I said, it's complex, but when you start thinking about it, you start to see the benefits are simple enough to understand and unpack once you start drilling down to what this additional features Bitcoin brings to the grid. But look, I want to get away from the grid now, because the other thing you said in your sort of intro, which was probably the reason I started following on Twitter, because there was sort of arguments I hadn't heard before, was around methane. And you talked about it briefly before. Now, from some of what I've read, from what you've written, methane, I might be wrong on this, correct me if I'm wrong, but is 80 times worse for climate change, if that's correct, than carbon dioxide, in the sense of methane in the atmosphere has a sort of increased effect on global warming.
It's 80 times more warming over a 20-year period than carbon dioxide, correct?
So, and I'm coming back to what you said at the start, things that can be done today with technologies today that are going to have the highest impact by 2030, which is when a lot of the climate goals are sort of based around. Yeah. You probably, I'm paraphrasing, but see methane as the low-hanging fruit from a climate change perspective, and Bitcoin mining as the way to capture that methane and turn it into a friendlier carbon dioxide in this case, but it makes it a lot more beneficial. Would that be correct?
Correct. I'm an idealist who became a pragmatist. So I have an ideal, which is to have a healthy planet, as a lot of us do.
Yep.
And right now, the single biggest threat to that is climate change. So that's why most of my actions out there in the world are doing whatever I can, using whatever skills I have to move us in the right direction. And then it's low-hanging fruit upon low-hanging fruit, because we all have only so many hours on this earth. And so I want to make sure that every hour is spent doing the thing that's going to have the biggest impact. So you're absolutely correct. If methane is 80 times more powerful than carbon dioxide over a 20-year period, and the United Nations Environment Program has just said that it's our strongest lever to mitigate climate change, then that's relatively low-hanging fruit. The other reason it's low-hanging fruit is that whilst on one hand, the levels of methane emissions are scary high, we also know exactly where they're coming from, and we also have ways where we can instantly shut them down, whereas with carbon dioxide, it's not so easy. Because to lower our carbon emissions, we've got to find technologies that replace them. You can't just turn off all the gas heaters in the middle of winter. People will freeze, people die. You can't do that. You can't just turn off all the coal plants that are firing up steel. You won't be able to make steel anymore. It takes time to invent the electrical process that replace the thermal processes. Whereas with methane leaks, we actually do have the technology right now, and it doesn't negatively impact society to start mitigating that methane. So why hasn't it happened? Well, the reason it hasn't happened has been that whilst there's no negative impact to society, nor is there a positive financial incentive.
Right.
And we live in a world where things happen for right or wrong. I mean, you could say, hey, wouldn't it be nice if people did the right thing irrespective of whether there was an incentive? It's not my role to question the way the world is. It's my role to accept it, whether I agree or not, meet it where it is, and say, well, okay, if the world runs on incentives, let's find the economic incentive. And so right now, if you look at methane as a source of global warming gas, it's coming from a number of sources. The three main sources: animal agriculture, oil and gas industry, and landfills. Those are the three by far major emitters.
Right.
Okay. Now, animal agriculture trying to mitigate that through technology, I don't believe that's either the right approach nor an easy approach. Which takes us to the other two. The other two, however, oil and gas methane and methane from landfills, that's something where technology can help us, and it can help us quite a lot. Now, there's a couple of different approaches. Now, in the climate movement, there's an adage, which is the perfect is the enemy of the good.
Yeah.
So what would be the perfect solution? The perfect solution would we just collect all that methane and we just store it somewhere, maybe underground, maybe we send it into space, maybe who knows, but we just store it. Now, unfortunately, that's neither available nor practical. So it's not technologically, the technology to sequester that level of methane is not around. And even if we did, it's like, well, what do we do with it? Where do we put it? So the next best thing is you combust that methane. And this is a really important subtlety, because if you know some basic chemistry, you might say, well, that doesn't sound good. When you combust a hydrocarbon, you get carbon dioxide. Yeah. But that comes back to your point. Yes, that's true. However, and this is a really important distinction, when you fire up your gas stove, your gas cooker, or your gas heater, that's carbon positive, because that's gas that would have stayed in the pipeline that is now escaping into the air in the form of carbon dioxide. So that's carbon dioxide. We want to replace that by electrified sources of heat.
Yeah.
However, when the gas was escaping into the air, leaching into the air and causing a greenhouse gas 80 times more warming than carbon dioxide, and then you combust that gas source, now it's like you have a count of 1 against you because you're creating some carbon dioxide, but you have credits of 20 or 30 because you've negated a greenhouse gas which is so many more times more powerful.
Yeah.
So a net balance, it ends up being, when you're using methane as a power source, in really simplistic terms, it is 13 times better for the environment than burning coal is bad for the environment. 13 times.
Yeah.
So it's massively, on net balance, it's net carbon negative. And this has been recognized by the EPA, the International Association of Energy, carboncredits.com. So this is not even carbon accounting. This is just carbon chemistry. So this is not buying offsets to make yourself carbon negative. This is genuinely carbon negative because you're stopping something which was much more warming than carbon dioxide go into the air.
Yeah. So basically what you're saying is this methane gas is going into the air already. That's happening. There's no incentive for anyone to stop it. It comes from landfills. It comes from, cows and sheep and agriculture. It comes from, is it leaks in oil and gas pipes? Is that where it comes from? Is it from flaring refineries or
combination? Yes.
Combination of that stuff.
Yeah.
So that's all happening. No one really has an incentive to change much of that now because it costs to capture that methane. So right now it goes into the environment. Yeah. If you could burn that off and change it into carbon dioxide, yes, it's carbon dioxide, but that's 13 times less or more harmful than the methane that's going in anywhere. So it has an immediate environmental impact on global warming, climate change, gases in the atmosphere. So how easy is that to do then? I mean, it sounds good in practice. The chemistry makes sense, but can you go to a landfill? I mean, I've never been to a landfill I can think of recently, but
not sort of place you plan to go to.
No, a big sprawling place, I'd imagine, with lots of stuff around, and the methane, I would imagine, would be coming from all over the shop. How practical would that be to capture and in a cost-effective way?
Well, this is where there's some good news. A lot of certainly in the West, a lot of the infrastructure to capture that methane already exists.
Right.
So they'll have piping systems.
Yep.
And they'll have vacuum systems to collect that methane into a single place. And then what will happen with it? Either it's waiting for one day for some solution that's never come, or they'll be flaring it. And if they're flaring it, what it means is they're just burning it. So it's like a big, you've probably seen them on oil fields.
Yes.
See them on landfills as well. Now, the problem with flaring, there's a few problems. Number one, it's expensive for the infrastructure. It costs $1 million for every flare stack, and a big landfill may need several flares. They cost hundreds of thousands per year, a minimum of 100,000. But there's a bigger problem, which is they don't combust the methane 100%. Right. The data tells us, the official International Association of Energy data tells us that at best they're at 92% burning that methane. So in other words, 8% of the methane is escaping anyway. And you might say, well, that's better than nothing. And yes, that's true. It's a lot better than nothing. However, they're also releasing soot, which has its own climate and pollution implications. The other thing that happens is that when regulation is used as the incentive, these flares might go out, they might be unlit. It might not be burning all the methane on the site. So you might have a landfill that has the capacity to generate 10 megawatts.
Yeah.
And the flare is only dealing with 2 megawatts, which means 80% is still vented. Yeah. But to the regulator, it gets a tick in the box because they can see visual evidence that the landfill operators tried to do something. Now, in some areas, they'll be more strict and there'll be environmental measuring and monitoring. But still, this has been generally unsuccessful in creating change. And that's why even in the US, which is one of the most highly regulated countries in the world from an environmental point of view, is that the landfills are currently only 30% of them are flaring.
Right. Okay.
The other 70% are venting directly into the atmosphere. And the reason is exactly what we're talking about. There is no economic incentive to do otherwise. And here's the interesting thing. When people have taken measurements of landfill emissions, do you know where the highest emitters of methane were? They were the ones who had flare stacks there.
Really?
What that's telling us is these landfills were absolutely huge.
Yeah.
They put up a flare to deal with part of the problem, so they took some regulatory pressure off themselves, but they're still emitting massive quantities of methane. So to your question, is it easy to then use that as a source of power? Yes and no. So the easy part is the technology already exists, and it's very simple. All you do is you collect that gas, which already is collected in a central repository. You collect it, and rather than burning it in a flare stack or just letting it go into the atmosphere, you put it into a microturbine, a generator.
Right.
And what that generator does is it'll convert that. Well, actually, beforehand, you put it into a purifier because you have to purify, take all the nasties from the landfill gas before you can put it into a generator to burn it. And so the purifier does its bit, sends the purified methane to the generator, and then the generator spins up a turbine and uses it to create electricity. That's the easy bit.
Yep.
The hard bit, and the reason this hasn't happened, is then what do you do with that electricity? And there hasn't been a good answer because in most cases, the landfill, look, we live in a wireless age, right? If I want to send you a message, it's easy. I don't need a wire to connect this to you. We can send it through the sky. And sometimes we forget that electricity doesn't work like that. It needs wires. So if you don't have pylons and you don't have a grid internet connection point, you can't just connect that to the grid. You might say, well, we should build out some infrastructure. Well, yes, you can. Anything's possible in theory. But as you know, that takes money, that takes investment, that takes resource consent, that takes time. And typically it's going to cost at least $1 million per mile to build out that grid infrastructure, plus the time delays to build it out. And by the time you actually price it in, you're going to spend more money on infrastructure than you could make back in 20 years, which is the reason why it hasn't happened. So a preferable approach is to say, if we could use that electricity on site, if we didn't have that additional cost. Okay, so now we've narrowed down the pool. Yeah, we know you need a purifier and a generator. We know that the best way is an on-site use. And you say, well, what could we do with it on site? Well, I suppose we could use it to power the batteries for EVs and e-trucks. You know, maybe we could use it to power the equipment. Yes, you can. Yeah. But again, that's only going to be so much. There's only going to be so many e-trucks, and that's waiting until e-trucks exist. There's only going to be so much e-machinery at that landfill. What do we do with the surplus? Well, we could have a data center there, maybe. Well, okay, so data centers are expensive. They need a lot of resilience. They can't be interruptible. Yeah. This methane supply is not going to be constant. It's going to be changing in its frequency. Yeah. And so your power supply will be inconsistent, which means your data center will not be getting your 24/7 uninterrupted needs of their customers met. Yeah. So, okay, so it's not going to be it's going to have to be an interruptible data center. Okay, so what interruptible data centers do we have? Well, we could use seismic processing. We could use artificial intelligence, or we could use proof of work-based crypto mining, which was up until yesterday, Ethereum, Doge, and Bitcoin, and a couple of other really small ones. Yeah. Now it's simply Doge and Bitcoin. And of that, Doge is tiny, Bitcoin is large. So we only really have one user at scale, plus interruptible computationally intensive processes that can be users of that electricity. And of the two, you do the maths, And Bitcoin mining is preferable because the infrastructure it requires is less. You can basically put it in a shipping container.
Yep.
The capital investment is less. And you don't need as much power. You can scale up and scale down perfectly. So at some point in the future, you may have more interruptible processes, but right now, the thing that stacks up the best by far is proof of work-based crypto mining.
Yeah, look, it's interesting because it comes back to, it's sort of, there's analogies with the power grid. It comes back to incentives and costs. There are things you could do with this methane, other things you could do, but as you said, 70% of America, let's take the USA, the most regulated landfill place in the world probably, does have, regulatory methods to try and do something with this methane. But when the incentives are not there to keep that up, then landfill operators are just going to ignore that. If they have an incentive to actually capture that methane because it's going to make them money through Bitcoin mining, it changes the incentive structure, changes the behavior.
Changes everything. So really good point. So there's two things here. The EPA in the States are very pro this because they recognize better than anyone that being a regulator is hard.
Yep.
And you've got a stick, but if you can find carrots so you don't have to use that stick, that makes life much easier for the regulators.
Yep.
And they say on their website, they've said, why aren't there more incentives for people to monetize? They don't use the word monetize, but why aren't there more incentives to use this landfill gas for power?
Yeah.
And now there is. And it's just, again, this bizarre accident. Bitcoin was never designed to solve environmental problems, but somehow accidentally, it just ends up, I don't know how, that she solves some really serious problems with grid instability, and it solves some problems with mitigating methane. And I think part of it is, there is a common element here, and that's the fact that it's interruptible and it's location agnostic. Mm. And we haven't had users of electricity who have been location agnostic and so highly interruptible in the past. And a lot of it comes down to the beauty of what's called the proof of work algorithm. Yeah. I mean, what people don't understand is that Bitcoin is very unique because it's not like a artificial intelligence, which performs one process over an hour or 5 hours or 50 hours or 20 days. It's performing trillions of the same process every second, which means if you lose power, you don't lose any work at all. And there's very few users of electricity like that in the world. Yeah. And then the ones who are, they've got to be next to a grid. They can't just be in a shipping container somewhere on a landfill site. So it's incredibly unique. It's one of the most benevolent and flexible users. And that's come at exactly the right time in history where we need that on the grid side. And we also need it in terms of removing methane from our atmosphere. So it has two very important roles to play in the fight against climate change.
Look, the happy coincidence, again, you talk about Bitcoin was never designed for that purpose, but that's a happy coincidence that it can't do that at this point in time. The happy coincidence for me is a sort of sound money, neutral money sort of evangelist, or that's my belief that that's better for the world in general, that neutral sort of monetary unit, is that this further decentralizes the Bitcoin network by introducing a lot more varied sources of mining all around the world in different locations, which keeps the control of Bitcoin as decentralized as possible rather than centralizing in big, there are quite a few big sort of miners listed in the US Stock Exchange, Marathon, Hut24, and a few others. And rather than them just cementing up supply and getting cheap power and it becoming centralized, this again decentralizes the mining network further to anywhere in the world. I mean, talking about the USA as the most regulated, I can imagine landfills all over the world don't have any methane capture at all. So, most places in the world, this would just be methane going into the air. If it was a plug and play opportunity to go in there and create money for these places, I can't, from my perspective, can't see the disadvantage to that happening, which means the adoption rate, once proven, could be quite high.
Correct. The value proposition to the landfill operator in a regulated country is, would you like to either pay $1 million for a flare stack for every meg and a half, and then still be charged, have to buy offsets for the 8% of methane that it doesn't burn, and then have to pay $100,000 per flare stack per year? Or would you like to mitigate all or almost all of that methane, not have to pay any money, and be paid for the electricity that you're creating each year, and be able to use that payment for the community, because these are municipal landfills, and so that money is available to the community? So as ESG, it ticks the environmental box, but it also ticks the social box.
Yeah.
Because it's actually giving money back to the communities, and it's turning an environmental liability into an asset for the community.
Have you done any work on the economics of, say, your average landfill, on what a typical sort of average Bitcoin mining operation, how much that would make in revenue, like profit after, have you gone into like detail into the hard numbers on that and seen like, are we talking about a marginal benefit? Or are we talking like a really profitable operation? Or
well, it depends on the price of Bitcoin.
Okay.
So right now, it's still profitable.
Yep.
It's not highly profitable.
Yep.
As Bitcoin price starts to go up, it becomes more and more profitable.
Yep.
And the good thing is with a landfill, however, is that it's also some of the cheapest electricity that you can ever access.
Yeah.
Because even if you are a Marathon or a Hut 8 or a Riot, and you do get your wholesale electricity for 2.5 or 3 cents a kilowatt hour, you're not going to get it for less than that, because the solar or wind operator still has to make money. They've still sunk a lot of infrastructure to create the equipment for that, and they've got to get a return. Well, the landfill, they haven't had to build a solar farm. Well, what they've done is it's a byproduct of collecting waste. And suddenly they realize that they're a producer of power. And so that power has some potential value. Now, it's not a huge amount of value, but it does have some value. And it doesn't have as much value as it would if you were accessing that power from solar or wind, because the amount of capital expenditure to access it is more. Yeah. So like if you're using solar and wind, you don't have to sink your capex costs into buying a purifier or a generator for every megawatt of electricity. So it does cost more. So the economics, what that means is that you can't afford to pay as much for it. But because the landfill was never designed to try to monetize power, you can negotiate, you can find flexibility, and you can get a price which just still gives a return to the community. It still makes it economically viable to those Bitcoin mining operators.
So how close would this kind of thing be to becoming commercial then? For example, I saw that Vespine Energy, I think a Canadian company, raised $4.5 million almost, and they're starting to do it. You'd imagine a lot of companies or other sort of venture firms will be looking to see how that goes with them. Is there a lot of this kind of stuff planned coming soon, or is this still at the ideation stage of talking about it, trying to see if you can raise investment funds to go into it, or are we at the stage where this is going to happen in the next 6 to 12 months and it's going to happen in a big way? Where would we be in that sort of timeline, do you think?
I'd say somewhere in the middle. It's not as if we have another 20 rearing to go that are already financed, but nor is it that there's only one and everyone else is just ideas. It's somewhere in between. So right now we have Vespine. So they're the first ones. They've just secured $4.3 million of venture funding. They're based out of California. They have their first site, which they're going to install this year already, and they have many more in the pipeline for next year. So that's already happening.
Yep.
On the back of that, we also have a number in the pipeline which are currently raising capital. And we also have a huge groundswell of interest behind that. So at this stage, it's interest rather than investable companies. But the thing here is that very interesting thing is that because there's so much methane and because it's so much more warming than carbon dioxide, you don't actually need even that many landfills to start to turn the needle quite a lot.
Right.
And to give you an idea, currently you can calculate the emissions of the Bitcoin network. I actually did that recently. It's around 27 million tons of CO2 equivalent of the entire Bitcoin network.
Yep.
And of that, right now, according to the Bitcoin Mining Council, it's 59.5% based on renewable electricity. So 40.5 is fossil fuel based.
Fossil fuels, yeah.
So it doesn't actually take a lot to have quite a quantum difference on the carbon intensity of the whole network. So I'll give you an example. So 1 megawatt, no, say that again. Just under 5 megawatts of electricity, if you're using vented methane as your power source, that will make the entire Bitcoin network 1% less carbon negative, 1% less carbon positive.
Right.
So that's a very small amount of power to quite a major difference. One of these big enterprise mining companies right now, such as a Riot or Hut 8, the ones you mentioned, they might have 100 megawatt facilities, 150 megawatt facility. So if you have 50 landfills, and they might have 3 different mobile mining units, that's all you need, and suddenly the entire Bitcoin network has completely offset its carbon emissions.
That's tiny compared to how many landfills there are out there.
Relative to how many landfills, it's absolutely tiny. So the potential is enormous. So yes, we're at a very early stage right now.
Yeah.
Now, why I believe that I've made some projections in terms of when I believe the Bitcoin network will go carbon negative. So these projections are based on a couple of things. One is observing technology trends over a long time. The second is looking at recent history with flared gas. So what's happened with flared gas? Slightly different to vented gas. So this is when you're looking to offset or remove the methane emissions from the oil and gas industry. Yeah. And what happens there is that when you extract oil from the ground, there's also natural gas. And for a whole bunch of reasons, including the fact that they're too far from gas pipelines and they're too far from the grid, what a lot of oil companies will do is they'll simply burn that natural gas because it's not economical to transport it. So it's a tremendous economic waste. But again, you have all the problems with flaring. It doesn't burn all the methane, releases soot into the air, expensive, et cetera. They go out, they're unregulated, et cetera. Now, if you replace that with Bitcoin mining, then again, you mitigate almost all of the methane emissions and you can, so it's a net environmental positive. Now, in the last 2 years, we've brought online, in fact, less than 2 years, we've brought on 130 megawatts of flared based power sources. So that's in less than 2 years. Yep. So we went at the same rate. So it's a little bit more than 7 megawatts a month. We went at the same rate for vented methane. We would hit carbon negative as a network in the fourth quarter of 2024. So that's how little it needs. So we're potentially quite close.
I mean, when you say carbon negative, I suppose to clarify, it's doing the calculation that because methane is X times more harmful than carbon dioxide, you're making the calculation backwards to say, well, that is the equivalent of taking that amount of carbon dioxide out, even though it's putting carbon dioxide in. Because I know I've seen on Twitter some people try and make the argument to you that, well, this is not carbon negative because there's carbon dioxide.
So it's using the official methodology that climate scientists use and that the official language they use, and they talk about carbon dioxide equivalents. And so you create the multiplier for methane to create, you say, well, if this were carbon dioxide, what would be its equivalent? And you multiply it by its global warming potential, which is 84 over a 20-year period, or between 25 and 30 over a 100-year period. And then you do the maths on that and you work out what's the net balance in terms of the net good you've caused for the environment as a result of when you combust that methane versus when you send it directly into the air, causing all the climate havoc that creates.
Yeah, so that makes sense to me. And the strange thing I'm sort of finding, though, from just seeing some people correspond with you on Twitter on your argument, is that there is pushback against this. I mean, your argument to me is compelling and it makes sense. But for example, Greenpeace tweeted out today, I think it was, that we need to move off this proof of work mining. Ethereum's moved to proof of stake. Bitcoin needs to do the same. And you said before you were a former member of Greenpeace, and it seems that they have got this myopic viewpoint, which doesn't want to go into the second or third order effects of this stuff. It just wants to say proof of work mining, use of energy is bad, get rid of it. And why do you think there is, given what you've just talked about today and the nuance to it and the positive effects it can have on the climate immediately and short term, and like you said, by 2024, that's not long at all to potentially get to a carbon negative Bitcoin network that's decentralized. Why is there such big pushback, especially from people purporting to be, for the climate?
I think there's a couple of reasons, and I have actually, whilst I've realized that viewpoint is based on misinformation, I also have sympathy for it because I almost made the same mistake myself. Just after I purchased, so my backstory was during the global financial crisis, I got some financial advice to buy gold, and I did. And then I saw a documentary on the plane about how it was extracted from the Amazon rainforest, and I sold my gold the next day I could because it was so destructive to the environment. And then I bought some Bitcoin on the advice of a friend who was in the community in early 2017. And then I read a mainstream news article on its impacts on the environment and its power consumption. And I was like, oh man, here we go again. I'm going to have to sell this asset too, because this is also bad for the environment.
Just my luck.
Yeah, just my luck. Exactly. Deja vu. And then I was just about to sell it. Thankfully, I reached out to my friend. I said, hey, this is terrible. I didn't realize what a terrible thing I'd bought. Have a look at this article. And he said, it's not true. He said, this is misinformation. He said, go and listen to this video by someone who knows what they're talking about. And he put me in touch with a video on YouTube by a guy called Andreas Antonopoulos, who had looked into the issue deeply and was talking about how it incentivized the build out of the renewable grid. And I thought, well, that sounds plausible. I wasn't 100% convinced because as an environmentalist, you hear a lot of greenwash. Yeah. So I was like, yeah, that sounds like it's probably true, but I'm not 100% convinced. You know, we have our skeptical radars up because so many companies out there will be polluting the environment. They'll stick a solar panel on the roof of their whatever it is and say, hey, we're green, and they'll use that to market themselves. So he sounded like a sincere guy. He sounded like he was an intelligent guy. He sounded like he looked into it more deeply than the article. But again, I wasn't 100%. I was still skeptical. So I kind of said, well, I'll hold the Bitcoin for now, but I wasn't 100% convinced. And then what I realized is, see, it's really hard because everything you read, if your source of information is the news media, then you're not going to hear the stories. You'll hear the story about when someone opens a gas plant, and they'll report it as being a coal plant, not a gas plant. You'll hear when someone is Bitcoin mining using coal tailings, which is this terrible environmental hazard, and they can catch on fire. They leak methane into the atmosphere, and they help to tidy these up. But it'll be reported as opening a coal plant, which is not true at all. You'll hear about when Marathon were powering up their Bitcoin based on coal, but it goes completely unreported when the very next year there's a new CEO who basically says we're exiting out of that power purchase agreement and we're at our own cost and we're transitioning to renewable energy in Texas. That goes unreported. So partly it's a function of what people read, and I was as victim to it as anyone. And when what you read is only telling a particular narrative, you're vulnerable to it. So that's the first part. The second part, though, is that it's non-obvious. And as an environmentalist, I was always told by my mum from an early age, rightly so, turn off the light, turn off the stove, conserve electricity, reduce your consumption. So we get used. I had a very strong neuroassociation from age 4 of more consumption is bad, less consumption is good. Yeah. And then when you're an adult at some stage, you have to question those things and say, is that always true? Yeah. And it turns out that's usually true, but it's not always true. The environmental impact is not a function of energy consumption by itself. And this is what Greenpeace got absolutely wrong. And I can understand why they got it wrong, but it's wrong. Not because it's universally wrong, but because it's oversimplistic. Whether it's good or bad for the environment is not a function of consumption. It's a function of consumption multiplied by the source of energy. Correct. Yeah. So when you're having a high energy consumption and it's mostly fossil fuel, that's terrible. We don't want that. We want to reduce that. 2 ways to reduce it. Either you reduce consumption or you reduce the fossil fuel component, or both. So Ethereum has chosen the option of we'll reduce consumption. So we'll change the algorithm so it doesn't consume as much. And good for them. Great. They've now rendered it so that it has fewer carbon emissions today. There's some consequences to that, which are negative down to long stream, but we'll talk about more about that later. But today it achieves an immediate apparent benefit in terms of carbon emissions. Okay, but what if your energy source? The other way to do it is you have an energy source which is carbon neutral. So your consumption is still the same, but you say, well, we'll convert to 100% renewables. Well, now you've got high consumption, but your source is renewable, so that's carbon neutral. And in fact, climate scientists and economists and energy engineers would say it's actually positive because it's displacing what would have been fossil fuel energy. So it's incentivizing the use of more renewables. Yeah. Okay, so that's another way you can do it. But then there's a third way of doing it, which is, well, what if your source of energy is not carbon positive, it's not coal or gas, it's not carbon neutral, like wind, hydro, solar, it's carbon negative. You're taking methane that would have gone into air and you're removing it from the air as a source of energy. Well, now you want your consumption to be higher Because the higher your consumption is, the more an environmental benefit you have the ability to create for the planet by taking methane that would have gone into the air and stopping it from going into the air. It's not going to solve climate change, but it gives us more time, because if that amount of methane continues to go into the atmosphere, we can get feedback loops this decade, which are irreversible. So this is incredibly urgent.
Yeah.
And so part of it is that we need to have a slightly more sophisticated understanding of what creates impact. It's not just energy consumption. It's the product of energy consumption plus the source of that consumption. Now, they could quite rightly say, well, that's all well in theory, but right now, very little of that is using vented methane, and that's true. However, we shouldn't race to indict a technology too early, because had we applied that thinking in the 1990s, you've got to remember, solar technology was invented in the 50s.
Yeah.
It took till the 90s. It was more than 30 years before it achieved carbon zero as a technology. And why was that? It was because it was very expensive, it was very inefficient, it didn't roll out very fast, and it required coal furnaces to melt the silicon. So it had a very high environmental footprint for a very long time. People forget that. Yeah. And a very low environmental benefit for a long time, for more than 30 years. Now, had we used the argument that it's consuming energy, it's bad for the environment, we could have banned them. And that ban would have stopped us from what we're now enjoying, which is a technology which is helping to displace fossil fuels. Thank goodness we didn't race to ban it. So we have to not only look at where a technology is today and say, well, this is all just a future benefit. We have to also look at the trend line and say, well, not just where is it today, does it have the capacity to become better for the environment, to use carbon negative sources of energy? Have we seen evidence of it doing it in the past? Well, yes, we have, because it's already doing that in the oil and gas industry with flared gas. And is it starting to do that now? Yes, again, it is with the Vespens of this world. And how much would it take to achieve carbon neutrality? Well, actually, it's not a lot. And then it's not going to stop there. So it's not as if end of 2024, it says, okay, our job's done. We'll go back to using fossil fuel. Not at all. We're going to keep on using more landfill gas because it's better for the environment. And frankly, it's a better economic model as well.
Yeah.
So then you have the capacity that by 2030, the Bitcoin network could actually be not only carbon negative, but carbon negative 10 times over.
Yeah.
And that's the sacrifice. So it's like you can go for the short win of saying, okay, we'll just use an algorithm that doesn't use as much electricity. But then the best you can ever achieve is carbon neutral.
Correct.
But if you say, well, let's continue with the promise this technology is showing, let's make sure we're using it responsibly. And I think environmental watchdogs should keep Bitcoin accountable and should make sure that this is not just theory, but it actually is realized, and we are using it on more carbon negative sources and carbon neutral sources of energy, then it can do tremendous good for the world. And again, this is something that's been recognized even by the White House. I want to read something out to you. So this is from their latest report. So they got a few things wrong, which is not surprising when it came to the grid. They didn't get that completely right, but they did get it right when it came to recognizing the importance of methane mitigation. And I think that's because it's easier to understand. It's quite easy to understand. You mitigate methane, you take it out of the air. That's really positive. The carbon is not ideal, but it's much better than the methane.
Yeah.
Whereas understanding grids, that's hard. So what they said was crypto asset mining operations that capture vented methane to produce electricity can produce positive results for the climate by converting potent methane to carbon dioxide during combustion. So I share that with you just to give you a reassurance that, again, these are not my opinions. This is things which climate scientists who work for the White House have said, yes, this is true. It does have this benefit. It is helping us meet our emission targets. And that was quite significant because that's the first time that a nation state has said that Bitcoin mining can be an environmental positive. First time that I'm aware of in history.
Yeah, look, it's big, and it's really good that White House report did mention that. My take on that probably is that there is this instinctual backlash against most new technologies, and it doesn't matter what it is. And given the climate we're in, with climate change being such a big deal, the knee-jerk reaction, as you said, even yourself went through it, is to push back against it. But I think hopefully, and the mainstream do that fairly easily because it's an easy story to push out there. It doesn't take much work for a journalist to just regurgitate what they hear from some official.
Correct. Correct.
But I think hopefully what like the company I work for is get like your case was very logical and compelling, backed by science. By no means is anyone ever 100% right, but at least it's putting the opposite case in front of people and explaining why. And hopefully the viewers at home will at least take from this, they'll be armed with facts. Because I think the way you push back narratives is with facts. You can't push back narratives with other narratives. You push back with facts. And there's been a lot of facts in this interview, and I'll probably have to watch it again and take some notes myself. But for the viewers at home, I think if you're having discussions with people in your circle, family, friends, and their knee-jerk reaction is this is bad, the two things you want to sort of take away is, look, there's two things. There's the methane argument, which is a very simple one to explain. You know, you're taking a much harmful gas out of the environment to a less harmful gas. It doesn't need much adoption to make a big difference to the climate. And then there's the grid stabilizer argument, I think, which is really, really interesting. Takes a bit more depth to get into, but we're talking at a time where we do want to make that transition to renewables, which might take 10, 15, 20 years. And you want investment into power grids, you want investment into renewable sources of energy. And the counterintuitive fact is Bitcoin mining actually incentivizes that to happen. It doesn't rely on regulators or government handouts or other stuff. It relies on private business, private enterprise, with the incentive of making money, God forbid. But as we know, that is how things tend to happen. Not always, but tend to happen more efficiently. You need the carrot, maybe you need the stick sometimes as well. But that is what Bitcoin mining is really doing in the background. And look, I'm fairly optimistic on this. I think people like yourself, Daniel, getting out there, spreading this message, plus potentially backing it with money and actually doing stuff with it. It'll be a very interesting space to watch. We probably should cut it off now. Probably talking about an hour. That's probably enough. I'd love to get you back again, maybe in a few months' time, or if anything exciting happens in your world, shoot us an email, and it'd be good to get you back on and see how things are developing. But I'll continue to follow you on Twitter and watch this space and see how we go.
Yeah, awesome. We can do an update when we've got a few more companies who are doing this and have a little tracker. One thing I'm keen to develop is just a little tracker as we virtually go towards that zero emission network and then shoot on past it and go carbon negative.
That'd be excellent. If you do that, send it my way. I'll chuck it on the newsletter every week. We'll have the little tracker moving up, hopefully, and that'd be great. So, Daniel, thanks for your time today. Really appreciate you coming on, and look forward to seeing how this all develops in the ever exciting and changing world of Bitcoin.
Cheers. Been fun.
Thank you. Cheers.